As President-elect Donald Trump prepares to take office, his economic rhetoric is already sending shockwaves through global markets. Today we'll discuss this issue with Mr. Peter Tanis, an economic expert from Washington, and Mr. Joel Rubin, a former U.S. State Department advisor from Washington, to unpack the implications of Trump's proposed tariffs and his warnings to BRICS nations about challenging the dollar's dominance. We'll explore how these declarations not only shape U.S. policy, but also reverberate across international economies, raising questions about inflation, trade wars, and the future of global financial stability. Gentlemen, welcome to Q News. I'll start off with Mr. Tanis. Sir, how do you assess the potential impact of Trump's proposed 100% tariffs on BRICS nations if they pursue a new currency to challenge the dollar?
I don't take it very seriously. I don't think anybody else does either. Remember that President-elect Trump has proposed tariffs on just about every nation in the world. He essentially proposed tariffs on everything that's coming into the United States and much higher tariffs on China. So his threat to the BRICS is, in one sense, not something very new. And this is an issue that I think a couple of months from now we won't be talking about anymore.
Mhm. Well, Mr. Rubin, how do you interpret Trump's threat of this 100% tariff on BRICS nations? What message is he trying to convey?
Well, I agree with my colleague on this. I frankly think that the message is more for a domestic audience, which most Americans could never tell you what the BRICS countries are, let alone what tariffs on them would do and why we should enact them. But what it does do is it portrays Donald Trump as a strong leader, as somebody who is willing to stand up to the ghosts of enemies abroad on behalf of the United States. So in reality, from a policy perspective, this doesn't make a lot of sense, even for his agenda, to jack up prices on Americans with tariffs against every country in the world. Could be very counterproductive to him politically. But what it does do is help to foster the image of him as somebody fighting against all of those countries who he believes are trying to take advantage of the United States.
Well, Mr. Tanis, if we try and explore the probability or possibility of the BRICS countries trying to create a unified currency or shifting away from the US dollar, what are the strategic differences among the BRICS countries that could hinder such a process?
Well, let me answer in two ways. One, we've heard this story for decades about replacing the dollar or weakening the dollar in international trade, and it just never happens. And your question is appropriate because not all of the BRICS countries are, because the BRICS has now expanded beyond the original four. Not all of them want to replace the dollar. I mean, Saudi Arabia is now part of the group, and I assure you they are not particularly interested in replacing the dollar since oil is priced in dollars, and that's not likely to go away. So again, let me just make another point, and I think Mr. Rubin made the same point. This is not a big domestic economic issue. For example, here, this is the front page of the New York Times today. There is not a single story on the front page of the New York Times about this issue, and yet in international circles, they're assuming that this is a major event in the United States. It isn't.
Mhm. Well, Mr. Rubin, considering the strategic differences among the BRICS members, as Mr. Tanis mentioned, as an example, Saudi Arabia, how feasible is it really, a unified currency among them in response to any U.S. pressure, even if it's not being taken seriously domestically in the U.S.?
For countries around the world to unify around a different currency, what would that be? Who would provide confidence to global markets for that currency to actually really take root and be utilized as the currency of global reserve? There's no real alternative. The Chinese certainly over the years have tried to make the yuan the global currency. That did not go very well. That has not gone well at all. The American dollar is strong, and it's the currency of reserve because the United States economy is the strongest economy in the world. And that's one of the paradoxes of this statement as well, I have to say, by the president-elect, which is that he ran a campaign describing the United States in decline and free fall economically, suffering compared to other countries. But the reality is the opposite. The reality is that the United States economy is incredibly powerful, strong, has robust growth compared to the rest of the world, low inflation compared to the rest of the world. There's a lot that needs to be done on income inequality in this country. There are major problems, but structurally, it is the world's strongest economy, and that prevents any other currency from really being able to leapfrog the American dollar and take the position that we currently enjoy.
Well, Mr. Tannis, if we have a macro outlook on Trump's economic policies, now how might they affect the inflation rates in both developing and developed nations if the terms that he usually uses are sanctions and tariffs?
Yeah, well, it doesn't take an economic genius to figure out that if his tariff ideas came to bear and came to fruition, that it would be highly inflationary. I mean, the math is very simple. If you impose a 10% tariff on everything we import, oh, and by the way, 60% on everything from China, and we import $500 billion worth of goods from China every year, that is going to increase the prices that Americans pay. And by the way, those countries are going to retaliate, so they will impose tariffs on American goods that they buy, which means that American factories and American companies are going to be at a disadvantage because they will be selling into markets with higher prices that will resist sales in those countries. So, of course, none of this makes sense. But the point here is that, Trump may be crazy in some ways, but he's crazy like a fox, because many of these countries thinks he's just crazy enough to impose these tariffs, whereas had it been happening in another administration, I mean, if Clinton or Biden or Obama had threatened to impose these tariffs, most countries would know that they know better. But with Trump, they're not so sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Rubin, if we go with a scenario that these tariffs will be implemented, what are the potential repercussions for the U.S. consumers if they were implemented? How might this impact inflation, product availability?
I mean, this is really the sort of description that my colleague's putting forward is the right one. How I have to say it this way: Donald Trump, when he ran his campaign, it was incredibly clever. He argued for tariffs, which sounds very patriotic, very much standing up on the side of the American worker against price gouging or deflation that is coming from abroad, harming us. But he also got away with it because the Harris campaign wasn't able to explain what my colleague just did, which is how it could actually be incredibly harmful for the American consumer. But now the question is, what will he do? Will he live up to his campaign rhetoric? Is there an expectation now amongst his voters in particular that tariffs will be slapped on to feel like they are having someone as their champion? And if he does that, would they be happy with the consequences, which would be inflationary across all manner of products, from agricultural products to timber, oil, gas, high technology, phones, you name it. Everything's going to go up, which is the opposite of what he stated he was most concerned about, which was the high inflation. So there's a policy conundrum here, but my bet is he can get away with it and tell his voters that it turns out we don't need more tariffs, or we don't need tariffs at all, which would be quite a turnabout. But he is clever in that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Tannis, assuming that such a threat is an empty threat, how or in what ways could Trump's threat of implementing these tariffs against BRICS nations escalate global economic tensions, even if it is seen as a candid message to the Chinese economy?
Yeah, because the solution obviously is in negotiation, and the threats are part of a negotiating process which will take place between these nations and will work out a formula where United States markets are protected where they need to be protected. Let me give you one specific example where tariffs make sense. Uh, the Chinese are the best manufacturers of electric vehicles. Their electric vehicles are terrific. They have great range. They cost a lot less than, and they practically destroyed the market in Europe for electric vehicles. We've imposed 100% tariff on them, so they don't come into the United States. That makes sense because we're protecting an important American industry. But for the rest of it, for what Mr. Rubin has said and what I have said, basically is that it's inflationary. It won't happen, but it could lead to productive negotiations. And as I said earlier, as far as tariffs are concerned, some of our trading partners are worried that Trump just might be crazy enough to impose them anyway, and that will lead to a better negotiating stance.
Well, Mr. Rubin, you've both mentioned that maybe it is not so realistic, the idea of BRICS countries creating a new currency to rival the US dollar, choosing a different currency. Now, because of the different interests of the BRICS nations, and you've mentioned Saudi Arabia as an example, what other challenges do they face, and do you see a possibility of resorting to a cryptocurrency?
Well, crypto is an interesting alternative, but it's not necessarily a replacement for the dollar. Much of crypto as well does require some connection to the dollar as a currency. I apologize for the noise. This is life in the modern era. But I do think that crypto is just one additional payment mechanism, but it still have to be converted into something of value. And that something of value at this stage still will be the American dollar as the backup currency.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Tanous, now not talking about shifting from the US dollar, the de-dollarization. Now, what other alternatives or alternative strategies might the BRICS countries adopt to reduce their reliance on the US dollar in trade?
Well, I mean, my point is they don't really need to. The question is, how do they solve whatever problems they have with trade in the United States? And the solution is not another currency. The solution is to engage in negotiations where trade works and it's a win-win on both sides. That is the right way to approach this, and ultimately, I think that's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Rubin, given Trump's history of using tariffs as a negotiation tactic, as Mr. Tanous mentioned, do you believe his warnings are more about posturing than actual policy? And if so, then why or why not?
Well, we're seeing this across the board. President-elect Trump, just last night, issued a threat to Hamas to release the hostages, or else there will be a savage attack on them, or response that they've never seen before, to paraphrase what he said. And I do think that we have to remember that for President-elect Trump, just like any other incoming president, they want to differentiate themselves from the previous president. And so people should be very aware that Donald Trump is not Joe Biden. What Donald Trump will do, policy-wise, will be different, of course, but he also is trying to show his personality, as he did before. That's an incredibly different personality, to try to create leverage, keep other countries off guard, make them pay attention to him as the new sheriff in town, as we say, the new commander in chief. And so I think, yes, of course, leverage is always an idea in the back of the mind, but there's also, quite frankly, the belief in differentiation, in doing it differently from the previous guy, a person who he also was very critical of throughout the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Tannis, using these threats as a negotiation tactic, what do you think are the long-term implications for this for the US economic power? Do you think that this might be signaling some sort of a US concern about the power of its economy?
No, I mean, as we both said, the United States is the strongest economy in the world. And even more importantly, it's the most trusted economy in the world. Foreign investors trust American institutions. And that is terribly important because there's a lot more trust than there is in Russia or China or any of the other countries that might seek to replace the dollar. The American economy is strong. It will stay strong. Trump ran on the American economy in many respects. He was right in doing so. And what he is doing is trying to protect American businesses and going about it in somewhat unorthodox ways. But in the end, as we mentioned before, it's negotiations that are going to eventually see this through one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Rubin, let me ask you now, how might Trump's stance on BRICS and the tariffs affect international relations, particularly with countries like China and Russia that are key members of the group?
Well, that's now the risk. And Mr. Tennis and I have been talking about the upsides, but the downside risk is that countries will lose confidence in the United States. They'll see a mercurial leader, someone who's willing to threaten in the middle of the night, out of the blue, not based upon some cause, but really on a whim. Who knows who he spoke with last? And losing confidence in the United States as a reliable ally, trading partner, diplomatic partner on a variety of security issues that are out there, that has a negative impact on the United States. And we did see that towards the end of his first term, where there was a continual trend towards greater isolation for the United States from many countries around the world, and a lack of confidence in where we really stood. And so I think that's, when you're talking about businesses in the private sector, they're looking for certainty and predictability. The investment environment matters. And part of that investment environment is the government that is overseeing the venues where the investment may occur. And that matters. I think that we have to be very careful of that as a potential risk.
Mr. Tannis, how might Trump's approach to BRICS influence future U.S. trade policies, especially with emerging economies looking to reduce their reliance on the dollar or at least try and diversify their trade partners?
Yeah, that's a tough one because there are some risks involved. And remember, these BRICS countries have very different individual relationships with the United States, especially in their expanded form now. So it's pretty much going to be not so much the BRICS as a whole unit, but individual relationships with many of these countries, particularly the more important ones like India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. So, and obviously China, but China is one of the most important trading partners with the United States, and it's one where we need to put the most emphasis. But here again, this is something where the negotiating aspect of this is going to prevail, and not threats of tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Peter Tannis, an economic expert, and Mr. Joel Rubin, the former U.S. State Department advisor. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for your insights on this show.